Hi there, welcome to this vodcast on the town that was murdered, looking at the Jarrow Crusade of 1936. This is a vodcast for relentlesshistory.wordpress.com, and you can find us in this video at that website, or you can find the links at Brayton History on Twitter. So, let's begin. First off, shipbuilding in the UK. You have to understand that shipbuilding in the UK was a really old industry. And because of that, when the Depression hit in the 1930s, it was one of the hardest hit industries in places like the Clyde in Scotland and on the Tyneside in the northeast of England. This was where unemployment was really hit hard. Now then, shipyard owners set up the NSS, the National Shipbuilders Security Limited, and the idea was they were going to rationalise the industry, making it more efficient. But what that really meant was they were simply buying shipyards and closing them down, selling or renting out the land. The northeast in the Tyneside area, that was eligible for help under the Special Areas Act, where the government had some extra funding available to support these areas. So here's a picture of Jarrow right down here, and Jarrow is a town in Tyneside, and Tyneside was designated a special area. However, very little money from the scheme actually made it to Jarrow, and that's because they worked for Palmer Shipyard in Newcastle. Now, in 1934, it was one of the yards closed down, and because of that, because their industry had ceased to exist anymore, they got no funding whatsoever. They were devoid of that income stream. Unemployment reached 64% by 1935 in Jarrow. It affected everyone. The town situation grew worse. Because there was no industry, it meant every other aspect of Jarrow town life was affected. Think of it like this. Somebody gets unemployed. They're no longer able to shop as much in the shops, which means there's less demand for goods. Well, the shopkeeper's going to have to cut workers' pay or workers' hours. That's going to have a knock-on effect. Suppliers who supply goods for the shops, they're not going to be selling as many goods, so they're going to be making those kind of cuts as well. It has a knock-on effect. It's a trickle-down effect, a depression cycle. So, because they couldn't get any access to special areas scheme funding, it just simply manifested itself into an even worse situation. Unemployment began to fall by 1936, by the time of the Jarrow Crusade, but by then poverty had been a fact of life. In fact, if we have a look here, you can see the growth in unemployment up to about 1933, but even through to 36, it's still really high. Okay, so how are people reacting to this unemployment? Well, in other areas of the country, you had the NUWM, the National Unemployed Workers Movement, which was a communist-backed group, and they began these hunger marches to show the plight of the working class. You can see here, this is the Stockton branch here, and they marched through. In 1932, over 2,000 people participated in a hunger march. They aimed for another one in 34, and they were planning another one in 1936. But the people of Jarrow wanted to do something really quite different. Jarrow Borough Council wanted to distance themselves from this communist-backed group, the NUWM. The kind of respectable councillors, the moderates, wanted to maintain a cross-party appeal of Labour, Liberals and Conservatives. And the town itself was quite special. Jarrow was seen as staunchly Catholic. It therefore took this idea of it being a crusade rather than a march. It had a religious influence, and here's the march they were going to take. They marched down the middle of the country, making their way to London with a petition. And their petition was simply this. They just wanted work. They wanted to make sure they could provide for their families. They were convinced if the public were made aware of the plight, something would be done. They weren't wanting handouts. They were simply wanting jobs, like most people, were wanting at the time. But it was a non-political event. Well, the march began in October 1936, on the 5th of October, and the local Labour MP, a woman named Ellen Wilkinson, walked some of the way to generate publicity at the beginning of the march. Perhaps more famously, they had along a black Labrador that refused to leave them, and in fact went all the way along from Jarrow to London. It had been decided that women shouldn't follow them and enjoy the hardship of the march. This was to ensure the focus was on the concept of looking and gaining employment, and not to be similar to the NUWM. In fact, they had an agreement that if a man had a job offer, he was part of the group of 200 fit men chosen to walk, that he would be sent back straight away so he could get that job. Now, as I said, 200 fit men were chosen to walk the 300 miles. Over £1,000 was raised to cover their expenses, including they had things like they had a bus with all their pots and pans and equipment that would follow them behind them. They had waterproof overcoats, etc., to support them with that. And it was keeping with the idea that it was a crusade. They had a religious service on the eve of the march. So it's all very, very kind of religious, this idea of aiming to say something and not to have a political message. So what was a march like then? It was really, really disciplined. Every morning at 9:30 they were on the march. So they got up well in advance of that. They marched for 25 days, 10 minutes rest every 50 minutes of marching. Men with mouth organs played at the front as a kind of like a band, keeping the morale of the marchers up. And they received significant levels of support along the route from Labour and Conservative held areas. For example, in Leeds, they'd raised money so that they could get the train back from London to Jarrow. They also, in Barnsley, held the baths open so that the workers could relax in a bath. And in fact, I think it was Ellen Wilkinson again was mentioned as having a foam bath all to herself. They stayed overnight in town halls or in local hospitals or hostels as well, and they held public meetings along the route. So it wasn't just a kind of like a sponsored walk, so to speak. It was to ensure that people were educated about the plight of workers in Jarrow. And source A is really quite significant. It says one helper along the route described how on one occasion he saw a marcher take the ham from inside his sandwich and place it in an envelope. When asked what he was doing, he said, "I'm sending it to my home. My family haven't had meat in the house for 6 weeks." So it really shows the level of poverty people are suffering, and also how perhaps people were unaware of the degree of poverty in places like Jarrow. But again, this could be a one-off. We don't know if this was typical or not, but it's a useful source to show. Well, what happened when they arrived in London? When the marchers arrived in London, they got a mixed reception. The public were really quite supportive, but Stanley Baldwin's government refused to accept the petition that had been brought down from Jarrow. Baldwin, although part of a national government, was conservative, and the Conservative government were pretty much focused on this idea of the economy would sort itself out. That it didn't accept the petition or act really to bring jobs to Jarrow. In fact, because the workers had left Jarrow on the march down to London, they had their dole cut because they weren't actively seeking work. So this really indicates the situation within Jarrow and the poverty that's gone on there. It is a big case study for the unemployment topic. So it's really one you do need to know a lot about. But the key issues are the experiences of the unemployed. People in depressed areas were generally hit the hardest. The north, the northeast, the northwest, Scotland, South Wales, areas like that with the old industries of coal mining, textiles, shipbuilding, they were the ones that were hit really, really hard by the Depression. Prices rose during this time while benefits were being reduced. So this hit living standards really, really hard. And many on the dole were undernourished. A British Medical Association report put about 40% of people on the dole weren't eating enough for the minimum level of nutrition needed to live. Coupled with that, we also have the means test as well. Remember, the means test was a proposal in 1931 that there wasn't enough money to pay benefits, and this test basically tested how poor you were, and based on that, people were really, really poor. but it was really, really demeaning. Those on the dole had to prove they were poor enough to receive it. In essence, over 271,000 people failed the test and lost benefits in doing so. So you can see the Jarrow March is a reaction to the unemployment and the poverty that Britain was going under between 1931 and 1939. Well, I hope this has been useful. Remember, I'm just going to flick forward back to the beginning. There we go. That you can find this resource and other resources at relentlesshistory.wordpress.com, and you can find this link on Twitter. Good luck with your exams. Any problems, you can reply to this video and I'll be happy to reply back, and follow the rest for how to answer the questions.